Hello, everybody. I'm Felix Wemheuer. I'm professor for modern China studies at the University of Cologne, and this is my YouTube channel, Studying Maoist China. And today I have a special guest, is Matt Galway. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Felix. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, he is a lecturer for Chinese history at Australia National University, and he got his PhD from University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And among his many publication is also a new edited volume together with Mark Opper, Experiments with Marxism-Leninism in Cold War Southeast Asia. It came out last year with Australian National University Press and is also available open access. But today I like to discuss with Matt his new book. I think it's built on your dissertation, right? The
It
dissertation
is.
project, yeah. Yeah, it's the emergence of global Maoism, China's red evangelism, and the Cambodian communist movement 1949 to 1979. It came out with Cornell University Press last year, and it's the first time on this channel that we will talk about Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge. Yeah, so let me start with the first question. You decided to analyze the development of the Cambodian communist movement, especially the Khmer Rouge, within the framework of global Maoism. In chapter 1, you show that Mao's ideas and policies changed greatly over time. However, in the end, you distinguish between two major strands, bureaucratic Maoism and faith Maoism. Please explain this definition in more detail, and how is this related to Cambodia?
Well, thank you for the great question, Felix. I owe these categories to Kenneth Jowett, whose book, New World Disorder, used this neo-Weberian model as an explanatory tool without, eliding historical complexities and trying to explain the Leninist response to global dependency. And what I see in these two categories is a useful way of looking at Maoism as, in these two cases, as something that is the bureaucratic Maoism that incorporates Mao's socioeconomic analyses and involves implementing a pragmatic form of revolution that the ideologues, the framers base on a class-wide united front. Whereas the faith Maoism is much more it hinges itself upon faith in the charismatic authority of the leader, right? So the bureaucratic one is more kind of around implementing the methodology of implementing the leader's ideas pragmatically, and the faith-oriented Maoism, faith Maoism, is where ideology is framed by those ideologues, by those leaders, by those zealots or lieutenants as faith in the leader's charismatic authority to implement that vision. Now, where this figures into Cambodia is that those same processes occur. Whereas in Maoist China, or in China during the lead up to the establishment of the PRC in 1949, you had people who were loyal to Mao and kind of brought under his orbit and were the most vocal supporters of him in Yan'an. And these are the folks who kind of form that brain trust that skyrockets him to supreme theorist of the CCP and then the PRC. And the same occurs with the Khmer Rouge, or the Communist Party of Kampuchea. This is a party that, Paris-educated intellectuals, they go their different ways. Some pursue the academic route with a view towards becoming political ministers in their home country, and others say, stop this, we're going to go right to the front to become revolutionaries. And in 1967, they're all brought together, and I'll discuss this a little bit later, and they kind of form a collective leadership that eventually will shatter as both of those strands kind of get pulled apart. Some think there needs to be more pragmatic, more stage-oriented approach to implementing Maoism in Cambodia, where others say, we are unlike any revolution in the world. We are the unique in our commitment to pure socialism. We can outdo those revolutions that didn't go far enough.
Yeah. Do these categories of bureaucratic Maoism and faith Maoism also apply to certain periods of PSC history? I try to understand it. For example, the early 1950s were more bureaucratic Maoism, and the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution you would label as faith Maoism, or?
You see them more kind of more prominent in those periods, for sure. Certainly in chapter 1, this is what I try and show. And I think kind of the big kind of watershed moment in the dissolution of these strands working together, the Yan'an Maoism that had marked the party's rise to power in the first few years of its implementation of its Maoist vision, was at Lushan. Now, I don't talk about that so much in my book. I had a section on it, but it did not make the chopping block. Alessandro Russo's book goes into more detail about that. But just this whole kind of post-leap retrenchment period after the Great Leap Forward, where Mao kind of semi-retires, and then there's this push by the most ardent and most vocal supporters of Mao, who say that his wisdom is unquestionable. These are people like Lin Biao. And those who are more critical have to kind of not so much fall on their sword, but have to either keep quiet or fear getting purged. And the same happens in the Khmer Rouge in 1975 and then later in 77, where the people who say, well, wait a minute, we shouldn't evacuate all of the cities. We should do a more stage-oriented approach to this. We shouldn't abolish currency. We shouldn't abolish religion and persecute monks. These are the people who are the first to go against the wall for the Khmer Rouge. And those who are a little bit more quiet with their criticism, or those who are able to survive, even while remaining critical, eventually find themselves at the S21 prison in Tuol Sleng in Phnom Penh, which stands today as a monument to some of the most horrific period of the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah, if I understand your book correctly, you also argue that the claim of the Khmer Rouge that they are so unique is also quite Maoist, right?
Certainly, yes.
Yeah.
So one of the things I try and do with this book is to show that one of the core features of Maoism, so not Mao Zedong Sisiang, not Mao Zedong thought as implemented and codified in the PRC Constitution, but as exported in exported form, because Maoism, of course, Maozhuyi exists as exported form. Is that there must be a continued perpetual revolution, right? There needs to be a Buduan Geming. And this means that it needs to modify and claim uniqueness, or at least needs to be its own thing. It needs to be applied by those who are wielding it to the concrete realities as they see them. So you see this with the Prachanda path in Nepal. You see this with the Naxalbari or Naxalites in India in the 60s and 70s, and arguably ongoing, and of course with the Khmer Rouge. The thing that they did that was particularly different from these ones is that they would cut many of the theorists, including Pol Pot, despite his speeches in the late 70s, owing to Chinese support to keep his revolution going, that they would, behind closed doors and back in Cambodia, would claim that they would never borrow from China at all, and that their revolution is hinged entirely on their concrete realities as they saw them. And this, of course, we all know is complete hogwash.
Yeah. So the next question, in your book, you argue that for the formation of the Maoist ideology, it played an important role that several future leaders of the Khmer Rouge, such as Pol Pot, studied in Paris in the 1950s, especially the doctoral dissertation of Hoi Yong, I don't know how to spell it, and the research of Hu Min on the agrarian question in Paris set foundation for policies in Cambodia. How would a foreign student become a Maoist in Paris in the early or mid-1950s? By that point of time, many Western observers considered the People's Republic of China a Soviet satellite state, and the Communist Party of France followed the line of Moscow. How did these young intellectuals, and why did these young intellectuals see Maoism as a model for Cambodia?
Well, thank you, Felix. The first question that comes to mind for me when trying to answer this one is what really makes a Maoist. And one of the things that I try and do in this book is to show that there are many roots to Maoism. There are many roots to becoming a Maoist. And in the cases of Hu Yun and Hu Nim, these Paris-trained intellectuals, these guys who land in Paris in the late 1940s, early 1950s for Hu Nim, they're arriving relatively apolitical. They want the French gone, but they don't know how to do it. And Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism emerge as methods by which to achieve this. And that's an important thing to kind of state up front of why Maoism might appeal. It is an attractive methodology for eliminating colonialism. But when they get independence in 53, they see that not much else has changed. The French are gone, but corruption remains. Socioeconomic inequality remains, cyclical underdevelopment and dependency remains, market exploitation remains. The lot of the peasantry, the rural sector, and that stark rural-urban divide is even more pronounced than before. So these men become, specifically Hu Yun, become very interested in doing what Mao did, going into these very deep socioeconomic analyses, breaking down the classes in rural society and identifying and diagnosing empirically what are the ills of the countryside that are causing its problems, right? And so this is very much like you saw with Mao, with Xinguo and his various other rural investigations. And I think with Huyun and Hunim, they're not necessarily openly subscribing and declaring that they are themselves Maoist because they want to keep their bursaries, right? They're still owing to their benefactors to studying in France, but they're very much gradually understanding that Mao's analyses are ones that they see happening. These are patterns that they see in Cambodia. Now, there are significant differences between Cambodia and China. I'll get into that later, and that's one of the main problems and why these analyses, when implemented by the Khmer Rouge in the 70s, is a disaster. But at the same time, they're really kind of drawn to that political economy of Maoism. And that kind of creates inroads that by the 1960s, they're like, well, look, I've relied on Mao's analyses of the countryside. I relied on Mao's analyses of the global situation with Three Worlds Theory. I relied on China as an Asian power, an example of an Asian power that has risen and stood on its own feet. And then in the late 1950s, defied the Soviet Union and breaking from them and declaring their socialist imperialism the biggest threat to world peace. And I think that's the push for a lot of these guys, particularly Hu Nim, to not only become a Maoist, but go to China and actually visit and subscribe to the revolutionary model that the PRC is setting for the world to see.
But their research on the agrarian question in the 1950s was already based on a rural investigation in the villages, or was this more product came out from the libraries of Paris?
These are very kind of extensive rural investigations that had been conducted locally. So the thing is what's important is that Hu Yun's dissertation is a huge influence on Khieu Samphan, and Khieu Samphan it becomes, you know, he just recently was sentenced to life imprisonment as for wars, crimes against humanity in the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia. And his 1959 doctoral dissertation is influence on the 65 doctoral dissertation by Hu Nim. But Hu Nim has updated statistics. So Hu Yun's and Khieu Samphan's are very restrictive. They picked certain provinces and highlighted cleavages and problems and you know, kind of exploitation patterns that existed there, and then applied them, kind of fit them to the percussion bed of the whole country. And that's one of the many problems with these analyses. Hu Nim used updated data, updated information that spanned the 1950s up until the 60s, and thus his dissertation, the Economic Public Services of Cambodia, is the most authoritative and uses the widest kind of resource base. But yes, of course, you can see in the references by Hu Yun and Khieu Samphan that they're also owing a lot to French socioeconomic analyses, particularly the works of Jean Delvert. So in that case, you know, you can already say that there are problems and warning signs to be seen in those texts, but they are nevertheless important, kind of these initial forays into doing rural investigations with a critical eye in Cambodia, as no prior studies had been conducted by Cambodians themselves.
Yeah. Let's talk more about the differences between the Chinese and the Cambodian society. So when a communist came into power in China, China was a very poor and agrarian country, and also Cambodia in 75 when the Khmer Rouge took power. China had been a semi-colony of many great powers, while Cambodia had been a French colony as part of Indochina, and China was partly destroyed by Japanese occupation, while Cambodia suffered greatly from massive bombing of the US Air Force during the Vietnam War since '69. So what do you think are the major differences and similarities between the Chinese and Cambodian society?
Well, that's a great question, Felix. Thank you. The biggest differences is that the degree of landlordism that existed in China did not exist in Cambodia. Despite the efforts of Hu Yun and Khieu Samphan and Hu Nim to identify the degrees of landlordism in Cambodia, it just did not compare to China or even North Vietnam, which are case studies in Hu Nim's doctoral dissertation. So the fact that the language of these dissertations of rampant landlordism, it's just not true. You did have a landlordism problem in Cambodia, but it was not to the degree or even the same kind as what happened in China, and it didn't extend as deeply. The impoverishment of the peasants is also much heavier in parts of China than it is in Cambodia. You know, peasants, for the large part, even the most destitute, still owned small plots of land. Now, this land was of questionable quality, and with the horrible soil in Cambodia, like one of the worst in the region, and the very kind of spurious growing seasons, which the Khmer Rouge leaders did not listen to when they tried to do year-round rice cultivation between 75 and 79, you don't have much yield from that land. So it forced a lot of people into sharecropping. It forced a lot of people into almost indentured servitude in a sense. So this is what these analysts are kind of identifying as similar to the Chinese case, even though it is still very different. So I think in kind of digging into the complexities and differences between what's going on in China and Cambodia in terms of landlordism, you've got Brian DeMar's book, which is a really, really great kind of extensive study of that period. And then, of course, Ben Kiernan and David Chandler have both written extensively on how these doctoral dissertations kind of jumped to these conclusions and connected dots conveniently so that it could fit kind of the narrative that these analysts, Hu Yun and Kosampan, were trying to spin for their cases. Now, that is to say that Cambodia was still an extremely poor country. It remains an extremely poor country, and the rural-urban divide remains stark as it not nearly as bad, but it still remains an extremely wide socioeconomic gulf. And these intellectuals see in the peasant, as Mao did, an opportunity to reverse the country's ills if they invest in peasants. So they called for the establishment of mutual aid teams, of workers and peasants cooperatives. And this is where you start to see a lot of the Mao rhetoric kind of manifesting in their work. They see value in the peasants. They see value and opportunity in just giving them social uplift, then the rest of Cambodian society will follow. So I think that that's kind of what you see in the writings very similarly. The other thing also is that in both cases, the dissertation and Mao's own writing, you see both of the authors think that there are moral problems that need to be resolved, that this is a moral issue as well as a socioeconomic one, right? That we should be doing better. We should be taking care of our poorest. We should be lifting them from this bad position because we can do this. And it's just a matter of political will or a matter of revolutionary will in the case of Mao's later writings. So I think that's an element to it as well that's quite similar.
Yeah, and I also think that in Cambodia, in the cities, there was hardly any industry and industry working class, right? This also a difference to China, where you had in Shanghai and Manchuria some industries, right?
Exactly. And even when the Khmer Rouge takes power in 75, there is almost zero commitment to actually developing industry, despite their rhetoric, right? They even call their 4-year plan the super great leap forward, as to go one step further than Mao. Yet there's, Chinese donated tractors remain in ditches. Industrial materials are either underdeveloped or abandoned. And the whole country goes to almost exclusive agrarian cultivation, agricultural collectivization. And it's very hard to develop industry that way.
Yeah. Yeah, many people think of the Khmer Rouge as some kind of genocidal killers. In your book, Genocidal Violence appears relatively late in the narrative in chapter 6. You discuss the implementation of the Cambodian Maoist movement when the Khmer Rouge were in power between 75 and 79. Before that time, it seems to me you described Maoism of the Khmer Rouge as pretty standard. For example, establishing liberated areas in the countryside, implementing a violent land reform, building up peasant-based guerrilla to fight a long-lasting people's war, to promote an anti-imperialist, anti-feudal alliance under the slogan of a new democracy and purging enemies from the party. So also kind of pretty standard Maoist policies. Is also in China under Mao, the government forced parts of the urban population to return to the countryside, over 28 million people in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward between 61 and 63. However, the Chinese government never dismantled the whole city, such as the Khmer Rouge did in the case of the capital Phnom Penh. So why did the Maoist movement in Cambodia became so much more radical and violent than the Chinese one? What role did the Chinese government play to bring the Khmer Rouge into power and to maintain their regime for 4 years?
Well, it's a great question, Felix. Thank you for that one. I'll answer the second part first because I think it's the easiest one to do it. And it's important to note that China is a vocal supporter, a rhetorical supporter of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. They're also a vocal supporter of their one-time enemy, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who was personal friends with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. And they believed that after the 1970 bloodless coup that was backed by the CIA of Lon Nol, that the only horse in that race to support was the Khmer Rouge, with a return of Sihanouk then living in Beijing in exile, returned to the throne into leadership in Cambodia. But after 1975, and this is where Andrew Murtha's work, Brothers in Arms, and my book are trying to make kind of new headways in the field in, China becomes the subordinate party. China knows very little about the extent of the violence. People on the ground in the ethnic Chinese revolutionary movement that's supposed to support the Khmer Rouge are effectively told to go away, that they're not wanted. Jiao Chabu agents on the ground, like Vita Zhou, are told to wait in the city for information and that there's no need for them, that this will be Cambodia's movement. There's efforts by these technical advisors, as Andrew Murtha's work shows, who are agents in the field, kind of like, here, we'll show you how to use this, we'll show you how to use that. But ultimately, the Khmer Rouge are using their relationship with China to their advantage and not really giving them much to work on, not providing them updates. So in many cases, as Andy Murtha's book shows and as my book shows, China becomes the subordinate party, and the CPK, the Khmer Rouge, really don't so much rely on China to remain in power. Their kind of reliance on China really emerges after they're overthrown, because the CPK, of course, funds them and give them arms and provides support for them in taking power in 75 against the U.S.-backed Ronald regime. But after they're overthrown in 1979, it becomes a big international geopolitical incident, right? And even Jimmy Carter is saying, return the Khmer Rouge to power. We can't have a Moscow-backed, Hanoi-backed regime led by Hung Samrin and Hun Sen leading the government there. We can't have another satellite of the Soviet Union in Southeast Asia. So that's where China's kind of support of the Khmer Rouge becomes kind of full out and open and especially controversial, and it remains a sensitive topic in the country today. In terms of the nature of kind of genocidal violence and how this kind of changes from the Maoism that we saw, right? Is you're right, absolutely. Up until 1975, everything seems pretty boilerplate Maoist. Once the party takes over, the collective leadership, like the collective leadership in Beijing, starts to shatter as those kind of more political economist Maoists, those bureaucratic Maoists are saying, well, we need to do things progressively in stages. We can't start skipping stages here. We've taken power, and yes, we want to identify enemies. We want to identify those who would seek to undermine our revolution, but we shouldn't be jumping right to, for instance, the abolition of currency, which I know Mao toyed with for a period of time, but didn't ultimately do. We shouldn't consider executing all of the Vietnamese. So these voices, these more rational voices, start to become marginalized and even killed. Hu Yun's dying in kind of mysterious circumstances in either 75 or 76. And then as those kind of more rational figures within the party, and I say more rational, not to say that they're purely rational, but more rational than, say, Pol Pot or Yang Sari, those louder faith Maoists start to take the reins in a little bit more and establish their vision at the forefront, whether it's redressing for grievances against the Vietnamese at Geneva or bad treatment when the Vietnamese were kind of at the forefront of the Cambodian communist movement up until 1965 when the party, or 66 when the party rebrands as the Communist Party of Kampuchea, or it's simply just targeting all ethnic minorities full stop, including Muslim Chams, for execution, and just kind of establishing what they believe is a pure Khmer society, a pure socialist society, unequaled in the world. And that's when the rational voices, or the more rational voices of the party, are completely silent. And the radical vision, Pol Potist vision around Pol Pot and his most loyal and ardent supporters is the rule of the day.
Yeah. And what role did the interaction play between the leadership and the people on the ground who carried out this policy, right? There must be also many supporters on the ground.
Well, there was, and the way that the CPK kind of ran their movement is it's terrifying, but it's also quite fascinating. Is that they sold their revolution at every stage of the way as one defending Cambodia's territorial integrity, and that we are on the cusp of total annihilation. We must resist the Vietnamese. We must resist the CIA that's bombing us with Operation Menu and Operation Freedom Deal. We must protect our integrity. We must even go further and reclaim lost territories in Kampuchea Krom in South Cambodia, right? Which is, Kampuchea Krom at one point could arguably have extended out past Saigon into the, into South Vietnam. So ultimately, there's this message that they're selling a lot of people, that if you don't support us, you are supporting annihilation. And there are people who, of course, seek to benefit from this, and there are people who, who were out in Ratanakiri in the Northwest, who had been part of that movement from the beginning, living in the base areas. We call these the base people, or the CPK would call these the base people, and those who sought to lose everything just by staying in democratic Kampuchea. So people who had not supported the regime, people who had lived comfortably by their standards, people with an education, intellectuals, people who had supported the Lon Nol regime, people that even supported Sihanouk, members of the old Communist Party order, the Kampuchean Revolutionary People's Party. And these were people who ultimately were the first on the death list. Maybe after the Chams, who were often last on the distribution list, first on the death list. I'm quoting Ben Kiernan there. But ultimately, I think that's how they organize, or how they're able to kind of extend their rule is through fear, through hypervigilance, through this very, very grotesque commitment to protecting the territorial integrity at all costs, whatever that meant. And then, as chapter 3 of my book shows, the French are responsible for establishing that in kind of bounded terrain. And then through this other element, which is just racial animus. You need to hate the Vietnamese. They've always betrayed you. They are the enemy of the Cambodian people. And a lot of that racial animus remains very much present in Cambodian society today, as Andy Murtha has talked about extensively in his work.
Yeah, and you said that the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot were not so interested to push industrialization. Yeah, this is quite untypical for Marxist-Leninist movement. So how do you explain that?
In this case, this is one of the examples of Pol Potism, is in trying to adapt Maoism to the concrete realities as Pol Pot and his loyalists saw it. They did not see industry as the first hurdle to clear. They take agriculture as the basis, to quote from the Party Center document, the party's 4-year plan to build socialism in all fields. And this was what they believed is the way that you could start. If we build agriculture, we cultivate rice year round, and we collectivize entirely the whole country, end to end, root and stem, then we could make that transition to industrialization when we feel like we're ready to do that, which ultimately was never. And this is one of the many kind of aspects that I talk about in my book's final chapter of Pol Potism. And it is a decommitment from industrialization and a doubling or even tripling down on agricultural collectivization.
Okay, but they also wanted to fight a long-lasting people's war, right? For that, you made some economic foundation.
Well, certainly, and they would, in fact, wage that people's war in a very kind of fascinating way by invading Vietnam and engaging in a war with them. Just after Vietnam had reunified the country and ousting the United States from the region. And this is not only a bad idea, but one that ultimately cost the Khmer Rouge their position in political power. But why the leadership decided to neglect industry, why the leadership killed many of its top military minds before waging this war, why they killed experts en masse, why they just went about doing everything that seemingly would undermine their revolution's success, is one of those mysteries. And all we can do is, and what I hope my study will do, is pave the way for other studies who can get inside the heads of these men, who, sadly, many of whom are now dead or rejecting that they did anything wrong, like Akisahan. But my hope is that as further studies kind of pick up where I've left off, we'll be able to uncover the psyche and the reasoning behind all of these really foolhardy and radical and deadly decisions that these leaders have made in Cambodia.
Yeah, I think your book is an important start to understand this development. So thanks a lot for the interview, and bye.
Thank you so much, Felix. Glad to be here.